Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh. It's the Science Cafe with your host, Brian Mallow.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's Thursday night, so here at the museum, at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, it's Science Thursday, and tonight is our Science Cafe. So we're here in the Daily Planet Cafe in the Nature Research Center at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I think our music is still playing. Yeah, so we'll get that off, and we do this every Thursday, as you know, but the first Thursday of each month is Science Trivia Night, and that's always a lot of fun, and the rest of the Thursdays are a cafe like this, and the format is a relatively short presentation by our guests, maybe 20 minutes, and the rest of our program, we depend on you to be inquisitive and ask a lot of interesting questions. So the rest will be Q&A, and Katie and I will have microphones. We always ask that that everything spoken gets into a microphone because we record the shows. They go out live. It's streaming live right now on livestream.com/naturalsciences, and later it'll be archived there and on YouTube. So if you ever want to see yourself asking I don't want to put pressure on you, but now that you know that when you ask that question, you're on stage too. So anyway, we always get you're always such a good audience, and we always get lots of great comments and questions. So we're really looking forward to this. And this is another part of that One Health initiative you were talking about, right? We've had other veterinary-related topics, and they're always interesting and good. So for this one, we reached out to the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, and the topic tonight is rabies. And I've already had half of our cafe with our guest while bothering him while he ate, and got some answers to a few things. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to have a lot of questions if y'all don't. So like I said, he's with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, where he is the state public health veterinarian. How about a nice round of applause for Dr. Carl Williams?
Hi, thanks for having me. I did bring some slides, which are on some of the TV screens, and I'll try and be as brief as possible so we can get to some questions that you might have. But I'm here to talk about rabies, which is a very common disease in wildlife in North Carolina, but fortunately a rare disease in people in North Carolina and nationwide. We've only have about a handful of cases of rabies in the United States every year, and there have only been 2 identified human cases of rabies in North Carolina since 1955. But there are many exposures to rabies, and that's what we spend a lot of time working on with physicians and veterinarians to make sure that people and pets who've been exposed are adequately protected. Rabies is a viral disease that's been around for ages. It's been featured in the movies here, Old Yeller and To Kill a Mockingbird. And this reflects a time when canine rabies was still endemic in the United States. When people talk about rabies, there are a lot of different variants that exist that depend on the host species. And back when these movies were made, and especially for the time frames they reflected, the dog was still the predominant reservoir for rabies, which meant it had its own unique host-adapted virus variant. But that's essentially non-existent in the United States, Canada, and most of Mexico now due to the fact that we have comprehensive dog vaccination laws. In North Carolina, the General Assembly enacted the first mandatory canine vaccination law in 1935. It's been a requirement since then that if you own a dog, you must have it vaccinated against rabies. The same for cats since 1983 and ferrets since 2009. And because of those laws, we really don't see dogs with rabies anymore, and especially we don't see dogs with their own host-adapted variant. Rabies, this may be hard to see, but it's a good picture that depicts the pathogenesis of rabies and how it moves around and maintains itself in animals. And basically, this is a disease that's transmitted when you get bitten. And this is a depiction here of a dog biting a person on the leg. And what happens is it's transmitted through infectious saliva, gets deposited into skeletal muscle tissue, where it sits for a variable period of time, up to even 6 months, which is why some of you may have heard of a 6-month quarantine for a dog that's not vaccinated and exposed to rabies. That's to account for the full incubation period. But once that virus crosses over into the peripheral nervous system, it's really too late to do anything. And it crosses over at the neuromuscular junction, makes its way up to the brain, where it causes neuronal dysfunction, which causes the signs of rabies, aggression in a wild animal, fear of humans, aberrant behavior, and then it gets disseminated again back throughout the body, but actually in very high titers in the salivary glands, which is why it's shed through bites. It's bite to bite, so when one rabid animal bites another one, the cycle continues. And the same would work for people. People could theoretically become infectious, although we've never seen rabies transmitted from human to human outside of organ transplantation. So, I mentioned that rabies is a disease that we typically think of with dogs, but we really don't see dog rabies anymore. It's been vaccinated out of existence. But in its place is raccoon rabies. And this is just a map showing the distribution of raccoon rabies in 1988, actually. The book was published in 91, but the data is from 88. And what it shows is, you see North Carolina is relatively free of raccoon rabies, and we all know now that that's not the case. But what happened was sustained transmission of rabies in raccoons was first identified in Florida in the mid-40s, and it spread throughout the southeastern United States in the ensuing decades. In 1977, we know that some hunters from West Virginia went to collect raccoons in Florida because they needed more of them in West Virginia. But they unwittingly took some with rabies and started a second epizootic focus of the disease in the late 70s on the West Virginia border. And so by the late 1980s, North Carolina was sandwiched between two advancing epizootic fronts. And when you fast forward now to data from 2012, you can see that the entire eastern seaboard is covered in rabies associated with raccoons, including North Carolina. They are now the dominant terrestrial reservoir. So when you hear about rabid foxes or cattle or horses or dogs or cats or anything else for that matter, the source of it is the raccoon. So the raccoon is the dominant terrestrial reservoir, and that's why we spend a lot of time working with physicians and veterinarians helping assess people who have been bitten by raccoons or who have kept them as pets or whose dogs killed raccoons, because any raccoon exposure is a potential exposure to rabies. What would you suppose out of the raccoons that we test, how many are positive for rabies on a percentage basis? Any ideas? How many? 3%. Higher. Not that high. In between, about 45% of the raccoons we test are positive for rabies. So, having said that, though, that's a biased population because we don't maintain routine surveillance in wildlife. We only test raccoons that are submitted to us because they have bitten a person or an unvaccinated pet. The same can be said of foxes, where we see about 35% are positive, skunks, where we see about 60% positive. And for foxes, it's both red and gray. We don't distinguish. And coyotes, it's a little bit lower, but it's about 20 to 25% of the coyotes that are tested are positive for rabies. And so this is the type of situation we deal with. This is a real situation of a child that was bitten on his head in the backyard by a coyote. And so in a case like this, a lot of times physicians will call us when the child's in the emergency department. And what we're worried about, of course, the coyote's not a reservoir, but the raccoon is. And we know that the virus transmits easily between or from raccoons to coyotes and could transmit to a child. So in a case like this, that child needs rabies post-exposure prophylaxis. So in a case like that, too, at the time, that was a 4-year-old child. This was about 10 years ago, and it was in the newspaper. But for someone like that, you need to administer rabies vaccine, 4 doses plus rabies immune globulin, because rabies is not a routine childhood immunization. And also the immune globulin gets infused around the site of the bite, which you can see in this case is on the head. And for a child of that age, you certainly can't tell them to sit still, so it would have required conscious sedation. So rabies can be very expensive too, because a routine, a trip to the ED to manage this is going to be many, many thousands of dollars in rabies biologicals alone, let alone any reconstructive surgery and pain management. So it becomes very costly for people who've been exposed. And this is just an example of the algorithms we use. There's a lot of good information for clinicians that's available on how to manage patients and whether or not they should be treated. This is an algorithm I like that's came out in an emergency department infectious disease journal. But it's just an example, and you can find these online. So we talk about treatment, we're talking about vaccine. How many people still think that the vaccines, you need 14 to 21 doses in the stomach? A few hands. So that's what these products are. The one on the left is the simple vaccine from the early 1900s in use to about 1950. The one on the right is the duck embryo vaccine that was used up until 1980. And you can see on that one it even says at least 14 doses are required. Those are usually given in the abdomen. But those vaccines have been off the market since about the duck embryo vaccine since 1980. And what's replaced them are modern tissue culture vaccines, which require only 4 doses in the deltoid. But we find it interesting, a lot of people that we talk to, including some who weren't even born yet in 1980, still believe that rabies prophylaxis requires multiple doses in the stomach. And that's like an urban myth that persists. It was true one time, and had you been bitten by a rabid dog in 1975, that's what you'd have received. But those vaccines are long gone. But it's just an interesting piece of history. Now there's really only 2 companies that manufacture rabies vaccines for humans, Sanofi Pasteur and Novartis. Both of them are actually made in Europe, and it's part of the reason they're quite expensive. There's just not that many companies that manufacture them. So you've probably heard about the oral rabies vaccination program. And one of the problems with raccoon rabies is it really drives up the cost. It's a very expensive condition to deal with. And this is just an example of an East Coast state and a Midwestern state where Wisconsin's a little bit bigger in terms of square miles, but we're a little bit bigger in terms of population. But you see, the data looks relatively similar if we were to continue it out through 2014. There's orders of magnitude difference in the numbers of rabid animals that get encountered each year or identified each year. So in order to keep rabies out of the Midwest, the USDA has partnered with many state health departments to implement the oral rabies vaccination program. And this is just a map that shows the distribution of rabies by the dominant terrestrial reservoir. And you can see that in the Midwest and in California, it's primarily the skunk. But when you have skunks as your dominant terrestrial reservoir, you have a lot lower numbers. They just don't efficiently transmit the disease from one skunk to another like raccoons do. Now, clearly there's raccoons in Wisconsin and Texas, but you don't have that virus variant present in those states, nor do they want it in those states. So basically the red line indicates a cordon sanitaire of vaccination, where you've probably heard or read about the USDA dropping baits from airplanes to immunize raccoons, with the goal being to keep it out of the Midwest. We often get a lot of questions about people who want the oral rabies vaccine to vaccinate raccoons they see in their neighborhood or in their county, and that's not really the intent of it. The intent of it is to keep it out of the Midwest. And it's federally controlled as well. You just can't get it like a average veterinarian in a clinic can get rabies vaccine that you inject. This vaccine is controlled and really only used by the federal government. And there's one company called Vaccinia rabies glycoprotein, or that's the product. It's made by Marielle, and that's basically a picture of vaccinated raccoons with the shield and sword defending against the rabid raccoon that's got rabies written on his tail. The demonstration project was Cape Cod. They successfully kept rabies off of Cape Cod in Massachusetts for many years until the state cut funding for the program, and then rabies moved out, and now you can find it throughout Cape Cod. But it is an effective program, but it has to be continually used and applied on an annual basis. And this is why. When you look at the public health cost of rabies in 2 East Coast states before and after raccoon rabies, you see this information is dated, but it's the best that we have. So in New Jersey, they were spending $1,100 per 100,000 population before raccoon rabies, $74,000 per 100,000 after rabies. In Massachusetts, they were only administering 1.7 doses of PEP per 100,000 population, which is remarkably small. Before and after, it's up to 45. So you can see it has a tremendous impact on the population. And of course, all these people that need to get treated, they have to go to the emergency department, and somebody's got to pay for it. And it's usually the victim and their insurance providers. So as a result, you know, this is an opportunity I had to go ride what's commonly referred to as the vomit comet, but those are the planes that actually leave out of eastern Tennessee that bait Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia, Virginia for raccoon rabies. And what you see here next to the quarter is the actual bait that they drop. It's a recombinant live vaccinia virus that expresses rabies virus glycoprotein. If you can get immunity in at least 30% of the raccoons, you can prevent movement of it or advancement of the disease. And they've been doing this for 20 years now. It started in 1995, and they have successfully been able to keep rabies out of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi by using this mechanism where you fly over areas and you drop baits generally at a certain density, and then the raccoons eat it, become immunized, and the disease is contained. And then this is just a map that I downloaded on the USDA's website, but this is a kind of a close-up map of North Carolina and Tennessee, and those actually are the flight lanes that the planes follow while they're dropping the bait. And so you can see exactly where they're dropping the baits. And in North Carolina, it's primarily 7 western counties on the Tennessee border that are baited. So it's not anything that's going to be used in Raleigh to help control raccoon rabies. It's really designed to just apply it along the Appalachian Ridge. And you can see that gap there is by design. That's because they do raccoon density studies, and they exist at such a low level at those elevations that there's no need to bait there. So they don't fly over those areas and bait them. But they do fly at an elevation of literally just over the treetops, and these baits are made out of fish meal polymer. It's usually done right now. In fact, this time of year is when they'll start in a couple weeks covering North Carolina. They're working in Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia right now. But that plane, when you're in it, because you have to feed the machine that drops the baits, it's hot, It's up and down, and it smells like dead fish, and it really does, it's not the most pleasant experience. And then this is just an example in Yancey County of the USDA Wildlife Services. They go out and randomly trap raccoons then. They take a blood sample to see if they have actual rabies immunity. They take a tooth because the bait has a tetracycline biomarker in it. So you can look at a cross-section of the tooth to see if they actually ate the bait or if the immunity is natural. And then they just take some general information. They weigh the animals to see, see what they're like. And then they're released again. But they're trapped. They have these hard traps, and you put like peanut butter or sardines in it or something like that. And that's how they collect a certain subset of raccoons in every place that they bait because they want to verify that what they're doing is actually having an effect or has efficacy. But it's an interesting project, and we often get a lot of questions about it, mostly along the lines of, can I do it in Raleigh or can I do it in my neighborhood? And the answer is no. But once we explain to them what the limitations are and what it's really intended for, then people understand. And this is just my final slide. I like it because I like the peacefulness of the president with his dog and the little boy there. But the picture of the little boy is also a North Carolina news photo. And what you want to think about here is right before that picture was taken, that dog had just essentially disassembled a rabid raccoon. And then the little boy, thinking it was great, ran over and the dog licked him all over the face and in the mouth. So the question we got was, does the little boy need post-exposure prophylaxis? It wasn't a bite, but the raccoon had rabies. The dog, fortunately, was currently vaccinated, which is good, but the kid, obviously not. So I'll let you think about that. But that, I think, is that's kind of a really brief overview. I could talk literally all day and bore you to death about rabies, but that's kind of a high-level view of rabies in North Carolina and some of what we do to help try and control it.
All right, how about a nice round of applause for Dr. Carl Williams? And we'll open the floor to questions. If you have questions, raise your hand and get to them. I'll kick us off with one. So the thing about the dropping this bait for raccoons, how do you know raccoons are getting it? I mean, so I know now, I heard you say that when they trap them, they'll check to see if there's this tetracycline marker in their teeth. But, I mean, you're just dropping all this stuff. What would make it more appealing to raccoons than any other wild animals out there that might eat it all up?
Yeah.
And does that matter?
Well, it does, because you want to drop enough so that you hopefully have a adequate number of raccoons taking it up. But certainly foxes, dogs, little kids are going to find it. We call those non-target species. They're going to take it up and remove it from the environment so it's not available to the raccoon. It has been tested in dogs, cats, opossums, foxes, whatever. It's not going to pose any health hazard to those other species. Whether or not it works is another matter. It's only licensed to be efficacious in raccoons.
Okay. And now, so can all mammals carry rabies?
Yes. So any mammal can get rabies, and that even includes things like chipmunks and squirrels. But we're really not worried about rodents. The small rodents wouldn't survive an encounter that would expose them to rabies in the first place. If you think about it, if a fox gets a hold of a chipmunk, it's not going to be around long enough to infect another chipmunk or a person. It just becomes part of the food chain, or it dies pretty quickly thereafter. So we deal a lot with people who have bites from small rodents and rabbits, and there's always a question of, do they need rabies prophylaxis? And our recommendation is generally no, they do not.
Just because if one, that's right, that really is where I was going with that. I thought because rodents are more common, bats and rats are more common probably in the environment in general, so why aren't they? That really was my question. It's like, isn't it possible one rat escapes with a bite and then gives it to all his friends?
It's possible, but rabies transmission from a rodent to a human has never been documented.
Okay.
So it's unlikely to occur. So we try and, to the best we can, make our recommendations based on evidence. Now, you mentioned bats, and that's something I didn't talk about, but bats are the other reservoir species and are, in fact, the source of most human rabies cases in the United States now. So we do worry about bats when people wake up with one in their bedroom or get bitten by one, because they are a source of rabies for people.
Oh, and then I just wanted to clarify the one thing, just to be clear. When you said, when you asked about percentages in various animal populations, but you did say that it's not just, that's not really the percentage you expect in the wild amongst the entire population. It's
Probably artificially inflated. It's biased
because it was animals that you had reason to suspect.
Exactly. But when the USDA, part of their work is to find out what the baseline level of rabies is in a given area. So when they, in Western North Carolina, did not only density studies, but looked at the prevalence of raccoon and rabies, they found about 30% of the animals they selected at random had rabies. So, well, that's not 45%, it's still fairly significant. Now that is data from 2005, but it's what we have.
Okay. So we have a question right there.
So, two questions really about raccoons. Is there something special about raccoons that makes them a reservoir? And also, how can, assuming that that rabies is a fatal disease for raccoons, maybe it's not, how can the raccoon population sustain such a high prevalence of rabies without, how is that stable?
How does it not burn out? Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, just about any wildlife species can be a reservoir for rabies. For instance, there's a host-adapted variant for the Arctic fox, which is a reservoir in Canada and Alaska. There's a host-adapted variant called the North Central skunk variant in the northern United States, North Central and South Central in Texas. The skunk variant in California is a little bit different, but there's also a host-adapted fox and coyote variant in parts of Arizona. So a lot of carnivores can serve as reservoirs. What's unique about raccoons is that when you have a raccoon as a reservoir, you tend to have very high numbers of rabid animals. And not nearly as much research has been done about the survivability of raccoons, but we do know that once an animal starts shedding rabies virus, it generally dies pretty rapidly, because that means it's already been through the brain. Raccoons have been documented to survive while shedding for up to 21 days. So they live long enough, and they're territorial, that when they get sick, they move out of their territory, they bite and fight with other raccoons, and that really facilitates its transmission. So they can live, they're going to die. There's not been an identified, so in that regards, it's not a true reservoir, because usually the reservoir shouldn't succumb to its pathogen, but it's the best word we have. But in any event, with raccoons, they live just long enough that they can pass it on to other raccoons.
Carl?
Yes.
So I know that, groups of prairie dogs get bubonic plague. Does the same thing happen with rabies?
Yeah, the plague is fortunately something we don't have here naturally, and a different disease. But yes, you can see it in clusters, and we have had situations where, especially with cats, sometimes you see situations where you have a raccoon that might get into a group of unowned or stray cats and expose multiples of them, and several of them might develop rabies. Or you might see, when we first identified rabies in Cherokee County, especially in the very southwestern portion of it in 2008, we saw a lot of raccoons with rabies that year. I mean, kind of an inordinately high amount. So clearly it was moving into a population for the first time, and you saw kind of a clustering effect of it. So you can see that. It's probably not as pronounced as what you're going to see with prairie dogs and plague, but you can kind of see something like that.
Hey, I want to talk a little bit about bats. Unfortunately, I found a live bat in my house in the last 2 weeks. So I was trying to figure out how long do I have to make the decision? Do I get tested for rabies? The bat could not be tested. It died before they could test it. So just talk to me. What percentage of bats in North Carolina have rabies? Or
So about 2% of the bats in North Carolina are positive for rabies. And we can't break it down by species. There's 17 different species of bats in North Carolina. We regard all of them as being potentially rabid. But the question you have to ask when you find a bat in your home is, where was it in the house, and what were you doing, in the sense that do you think you were truly exposed to it?
see, I don't. I mean, it was in the living room just flying around one night, and I thought to myself, well, we close our bedrooms when we sleep, so I don't think it was in there. When I found it, I left the house and came back the next day, and they caught it the next night. But
So you were never asleep in the living room with the bat?
how long can a bat? No, I was not asleep in the living room. But how long can a bat live in your house without you knowing it?
Well, I would say probably not that long, because usually when a bat's flying around inside someone's house, they tend to notice it pretty quickly.
So they fly every night.
Well, that's what they would do if they were outside. Yeah, they want to get out. They don't want to be in anybody's house, obviously. Now, they may have a colony in the attic, and they can get in and out through unscreened gable end vents. But if they
found no evidence of any bats in the attic.
So it could just be a random event.
Yeah.
But if they get into the house and they get into an area where people are sleeping, we worry about that much more, because then there's the possibility that it could have had direct physical contact with the sleeping person and they wouldn't know it. But if you wake up and you find one in the kitchen, but nobody sleeps in the kitchen, we tend to not worry about it.
How long do you have before you decide whether you're going to take the virus or not? I mean, the antidote
vaccine.
or whatever.
So we say that if there is an exposure, we recommend treatment sooner rather than later. But really, any time before the onset of signs of disease is good. So post-exposure prophylaxis is a very accurate descriptor in that sense. Once the signs of disease develop, it's too late to do anything about it at that point. But what we'd recommend is if you had an exposure, that you not generally wait, that you would initiate prophylaxis.
You said bats don't like to be in anyone's houses, but you didn't mean to include Bruce Wayne in that, did you?
Yeah,
Just
I
checking.
don't know about that.
Hi.
Yes, sir.
So my question kind of has a whole bunch of different parts. First off, what is the persistence time for the rabies virus, as far as if an organism is infected, how long does it stay after the organism dies? And the second part to this question is, should we be worried about things like roadkill? Should we be trying to push forward for more control of the collateral that happens after this organism dies? And I guess what's your opinion on future, plans to deal with that?
So it does not have environmental persistence. It's the exact opposite of, say, something like anthrax, which can persist for decades. It's very susceptible to desiccation and UV light. It's inactivated by both. And that's actually a common question when we've had people call us up and say, there's a raccoon that's acting funny, it's in my front yard. Can I let my kids go out and play Frisbee in the front yard? If it's a bright sunny day, yeah, I mean, once it's gone, let it dry and then you're free to go out. You don't have to worry about that. If it was that easy to transmit, we'd see a lot more cases of it. In terms of roadkill, it's not really been studied. There's one reference in a textbook that talks about recovery of viable virus after 48 hours at 72 Fahrenheit. So we don't really think it persists very long in roadkill or carcasses. Probably in the heat of summer it's shorter, and in February it might be a little bit longer. You can freeze it and preserve it, and then it can be infectious later. So No one really knows. Having said that, we had a situation not too long ago where somebody found a dead raccoon. They wanted to try out, it wasn't a raccoon, it was a red fox, taxidermy. They took it home, started to cut it up, cut themselves. We weren't able to test it. I can't remember the circumstances, but in a situation like that, we recommend prophylaxis, kind of a abundance of caution in any event. But there's really not much information about the persistence in carcasses.
Carl.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering a little bit more about the history of rabies. It seems like rabies virus is pretty successful. My observation was as we got rid of it in dogs, it went into raccoons. I'm wondering if it might have played a role in population control, or if humans hadn't intervened, what would we think about rabies?
Well, you can look at other parts of the world where you still, on a worldwide basis, where exposures to rabies are common here. Cases of human rabies are rare, but in parts of China and India, human rabies deaths are still very common. The WHO estimates about 55,000 people die every year from rabies. It's mostly in India and China and Southeast Asia where you have uncontrolled canine rabies because they do not have mandatory vaccination laws. In fact, their usual response is to do dog cull campaigns where you go out, round up all the stray dogs and kill them, but that doesn't eliminate the canine rabies because new dogs will come in and they'll get the disease. So I think that, having said that though, in those countries you can still find rabies in wildlife. It's just that when you have rabies in dogs, and you have the canine variant in dogs, that is what really seems to cause majority of human rabies cases. Once you control canine rabies in dogs, which has largely been done in North America, then you see the human rabies cases drop precipitously.
I guess, again, what about the effect of the rabies on the raccoon populations?
Yeah, it doesn't, raccoon population estimates are hard to come by. If you think it's hard to estimate how many dogs there are in Wake County, it's almost impossible to figure out how many raccoons there are, but it doesn't seem to have that much of an impact. And there are a lot of stressors on raccoons, including other infectious diseases like canine distemper, and then just predation and motor vehicle accidents. I'm not a wildlife biologist. It's not my area of expertise, but it doesn't seem to be a major limiting factor on raccoon populations.
So how expensive are the airdrop vaccination campaigns? Because you would think maybe if the concern is about the cost of the disease and its treatment, it would be cheaper to just go ahead and vaccinate the whole range in which the rabies is present.
That's a great question. The little baits that I showed you cost, I want to say, about $1.25 a piece. And you're dropping them at a rate of maybe 100 per square kilometer. So you can figure out just the cost of the bait itself. And then, of course, you've got the technical staff, the airplane rental, fuel costs, all of that stuff that goes with it. The CDC has worked with the USDA, and they've done modeling studies to demonstrate that the oral rabies vaccination application of that program is more cost effective than letting rabies move into the Midwest, where you're going to get into other big cities, like that you're going to run into Nashville and Louisville and all those places where you'd see a huge cost increase. The goal of the USDA program ultimately is to move it east, but they've been saying that for 20 years. And one of the things that's always been a problem is that they have limited or reduced funding every year, or they have to fight for their funding. As you can imagine, they're part of the federal budget, and it's challenging. So they have to make their case every year to maintain the program. And right now it's just been kind of a status quo as opposed to moving it to the east. In theory, if funding was unlimited, it would be something that could be conceivably done. And when you look at what they did with oral rabies vaccination in Europe, I mean, they basically eliminated red fox spading or red fox rabies with oral vaccines in all of Western Europe, over 10 years ago. So it's possible, it's doable, it's been done. And of course, it's a red fox versus a raccoon, but the premise is not much different.
Hey, so my question kind of is a little far-fetched and goes back to this bat thing. So we obviously know a lot about rabies and how it is prevalent in sort of these mid-sized mammals, and we kind of know, well, with the smaller rodents, they die, they're eaten. My question is, do we really know what happens in those bats? So I know a lot of other viruses that are transmitted through the food web to humans are held as reservoirs in bat populations. For example, the people are hypothesizing that that's the case with Ebola, but there's a bunch of other viruses like that. So do we know if rabies acts the same way in bats as it does in other mammals, where they die very shortly after being infected, or is that something that we don't know about at all, or is there a possibility that these bats in the United States could also be reservoirs in the sense of a true reservoir where they're not dying, they're just holding a repressed, I guess, concentration of the virus?
Right. Yeah, I think I don't know as much about that as I do with the raccoons, but it is my general understanding that it's consistent, rabies is consistent across all mammalian species, and that, again, it will kill the bat. The bat may, with its own unique host-adapted strain, may live for a longer period of time, which allows it to transmit more readily, but it will ultimately succumb to the disease, and it does not persist as a true reservoir. But yeah, the bat is, in a general sense, theorized to be a reservoir for a lot of viruses, Nipah, Hendra, like he's mentioned, Ebola is a speculation. And similar animals like, the large flying foxes or fruit bats in Australia are reservoirs for Australian bat lyssavirus, which causes essentially clinical rabies in people. It's a different agent, but it's the same clinical disease. So I kind of know the answer.
This might not be your area of expertise, but say in the wild in North Carolina, do more animals die from rabies or distemper?
That I do not know. I think no one has really done any comprehensive studies of distemper. The Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study did that on some populations in Georgia some years ago. I think it's what we tell people when they see a sick raccoon, they'll think, well, it's got to be rabies, and we'll say, maybe, but it could also be distemper. But regardless, just leave it alone. While distemper is not a zoonotic disease, rabies is, so if you see an animal that's suspicious for rabies, the best thing is to just avoid it. But yeah, it's highly likely that distemper is a major cause of raccoon mortality.
Other thing I seem to remember is anytime you see an animal acting odd, like being out in the daytime or acting friendly or coming towards you, an animal that normally would be, hiding somewhere that is, you better watch out.
Yes and no. Again, these animals become habituated to people. I actually have pictures of a man in Durham County who feeds hot dogs to gray foxes, and they'll come up to him like dogs. They do not have rabies, but they've clearly lost their fear of people because they know they're going to get hot dogs. The same can be said of raccoons. They actually love kind of urban and suburban environments like this. It's great habitat because of garbage and excess food we don't eat, so they learn to come up to people. They learn to approach residences because it's a food source. So it's not necessarily true because they oftentimes get habituated to people, and people do things that aren't that bright in terms of deliberately trying to feed them, and it encourages the bad behavior, which then can have untoward consequences for both the raccoon and other people. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. In the beginning of your talk, I believe you said that at some point the people in West Virginia needed more raccoons and they imported them. I can't imagine. I guess I don't know enough about raccoons. Do they do anything good? And why would anybody do that?
Yeah, needed was being a little bit joking, I guess. So in North Carolina and in most states, there's a season for raccoon hunting and raccoon trapping, and people want them because you can sell the furs. They don't, you don't get as much money for them now as you used to. What happened in the late 70s was, I suspect, the populations were felt to be not adequate, so they went across state lines and brought in raccoons, which is nowadays, it probably was then, but clearly now it's illegal to move wildlife interstate like that without the appropriate permits from the DNR or Wildlife Commission of the two states. But what happened is back then in Florida, clearly the raccoon rabies epizootic had started, so they indiscriminately trapped raccoons, picked up some with rabies, and took them back with the sole intent of releasing them so that they could be later hunted or trapped. And that had a significant unintended consequence because it hastened the arrival of the rabies epidemic into those big East Coast cities like Baltimore, D.C., Philadelphia. Probably would have gotten there eventually, but it would have been much later. As to if they're everything must have a purpose. I don't know specifically. I'm not the one to answer. But, yeah.
What type of research is currently going on in terms of rabies treatment or vaccination to prevent it?
So, you know, to prevent it, rabies vaccine is available for certain occupational groups and international travelers, and like all vaccines, it's a great idea. You of course want to keep your children vaccinated. You want to get your influenza vaccine every year. And if you're a veterinarian or someone who's going to likely be exposed to rabies, there's a pre-exposure immunization. Likewise, if you're going to be an international traveler going to a rabies endemic area, there's a vaccine that's available. In terms of treatment, once the disease has manifested itself, that you might remember in 2004, the girl from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, got rabies but survived with the use of the so-called Milwaukee Protocol that Dr. Willoughby created. That has never been replicated, so it's been tried numerous times, and it's believed to have been more of a fluke that she survived than as a result of that specific protocol. So people are looking to determine whether or not there is any intervention once a person actually gets rabies, but it's not something that there's an answer for yet, unfortunately, which is why we spend so much time advocating up front about reducing your exposure. Keep your pet vaccinated, leave wildlife alone, and if you do get bit, get the pre-exposure prophylaxis, because once signs develop, it's probably going to be too late to do anything. Yes, sir.
What is involved in testing an animal for rabies, and how long does that test take? A few hours, a few days?
A few hours. It's called the direct fluorescent antibody test, which is done at the North Carolina State Laboratory of Public Health out on District Drive by the RBC Center, or what used to be called the RBC Center. What's required is a complete cross-section of the brainstem and cerebellum, so testing the animal is not compatible with life. It has to be euthanized, the head is removed, and then the appropriate portions of the brain are taken out, and then they use monoclonal antibodies that actually look for the presence of rabies virus glycoprotein, which is indicative of the virus being there, in the brain of the animal. So every year, the state lab tests about 5,000 different animals. So that means they're working, they typically get the heads. Heads are removed from the body at the county, and then they actually do the dissection to remove the brainstem and cerebellum and do the testing. And usually, if It usually takes about 6 hours for a complete run. So, and that's how it works.
I actually
Yes,
have a
ma'am.
question.
Yeah.
The bait that is put out, in the parks or wherever to keep the raccoons rabbit free on one
Right.
side, why is that federally restricted? Why couldn't, counties, decide they want to pay for that and do it themselves?
So, in some cases, the county can, but the county has to present a plan and their funding plan as well as their plan of action to implement it. And what's needed is you have to do pre-bait surveillance. You have to demonstrate the burden of disease that's in your county to begin with. Then how are you going to apply the baits? How are you going to pay for it? And how are you going to prove effectiveness? And that includes doing your raccoon density studies. And most counties simply don't have the resources to do that, which is why it's federally run by the Wildlife Services Agency that has those resources in terms of, statisticians and wildlife biologists. They also have the resources to acquire the product. So the company that manufactures it, it's got kind of a narrow market. So they want to make sure that where they're selling it is where it's going to be used as well. So some local counties, when it was started on Cape Cod, that wasn't a statewide effort. Hillsborough, Pinellas, Polk County, Florida have also used it, but they've done it where they've committed those resources. And that really means hiring a local infrastructure of people to do that. And that can be difficult when you want to try and create positions at a county government level, but that's what's needed to make sure that works.
Is it that there's a shortage of it? I mean, let's say it's mostly for this use to prevent the spread, but is there a reason why I couldn't just also buy some at a store and spread it around my yard? Is there, without any of those other precautions, is it that it's very, that there's a shortage and it has to all be used for those reasons?
Yeah, so, there's that. I'm sure the company could gear up production, but there's also, in general, state laws that restrict the use and distribution of rabies vaccine. Like unless you're a licensed veterinarian, you cannot just acquire rabies vaccine. Okay. Only licensed veterinarians can possess it and administer it in North Carolina. It's the same in most other states. It's kind of a restricted access product.
Is that something that can be abused in some way?
The concern is not that it could be abused, but that it could be inappropriately used. It's licensed only for specific species, and we certainly see people doing weird things like getting savanna cats and wolf hybrids with dogs and trying to vaccinate them in other states where it is available. And the vaccines are not intended for use in those species. Those are regarded as wild animals. Plus, there's the idea of, just like you don't go out and buy a DTP vaccine and give it to your kids, right. That's the purview of the physician. The same thing kind of holds with rabies and the veterinarian.
Okay. Well, Carl, this has been really fascinating, and we've covered a lot of stuff. I want to ask you one more question, too, which is, so twice, I live only a mile and a half from here, from downtown, and twice I've seen a fox at like 10, 11 at night run down the street or in my neighbor's yard, and at no time did I have any thought of rabies or danger or anything. I thought, fascinating. The one, it was trotting down the street, and it was cute, and it was like, hey, very cool wildlife in our neighborhood. But on this neighborhood email list just a couple days ago, someone said they reported a sighting of a fox, and they were worried about it, and people were talking about calling animal control, and I was like, wow, I didn't react that way at all to a fox in my neighborhood. Who's right and who's wrong? Or should I have been, or do we, like...
Well, everybody's entitled to their reactions, I suppose. But the reality is that foxes, I see them in my neighborhood too, in North Raleigh, and raccoons. They're all over the place.
Yeah.
It's a part of life to have them with us. Most of them, again, are not going to have rabies, so just leave them alone. But a lot of people will want to call animal control and maybe even get upset if Raleigh PD doesn't come out and pick up the fox. And, well, they don't have resources to go chasing down foxes that aren't bothering anybody in any county, in any state. So basically, just leave it alone is my advice.
Yeah. So we have covered a lot of stuff. What would you like us to leave here knowing? You got any parting words for us?
Vaccinate your dogs and cats. Keep them vaccinated against rabies. That's the biggest thing. Because what we didn't really get into is the whole veterinary side of it. If an unvaccinated dog is exposed to rabies, the state law requires that it go through a 6-month quarantine or be euthanized. Those are very painful situations when people love their pets but don't keep them vaccinated against rabies. So keep your pets vaccinated. It's good for them. It also protects the public. That's why it's been a law since 1935.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. How about a nice round of applause for Dr. Carl Williams? As we said, that's the end of our program, which you can find later on YouTube, on the museum YouTube channel, and also on livestream.com/natural sciences. This building is still open till 9, and next week is science trivia. So thank you very much. Good night.